Everyone in Palermo knew the shadow of Don Alessandro Martini. He was a man who didn't just demand respect. He carved it into flesh with his own tattooed hands. But the afternoon he cleared his restaurant and cornered a soft-spoken waitress named Sarah against the mahogany bar, he made the first fatal miscalculation of his brutal career. He thought he was teaching a lesson to a trembling girl who'd spilled his espresso. He didn't notice the surgical precision in how she gripped her serving tray, or the way her breathing never quickened despite her widening eyes. He didn't know that the woman apologizing in a quivering voice wasn't afraid of violence. She was afraid of the body count she'd leave behind if the killer inside her finally woke up. The king was about to meet his executioner wearing an apron. Before we begin, I need you to subscribe and tell me where you are watching from in the comments. I'm responding to everyone. The afternoon sun filtered through the gauze curtains of Ristorante Bella Vista, casting everything in amber light that made the crystal glasses glow like captured fire. Don Alessandro Martini sat at his usual corner table, the one that gave him a clear view of both entrances and the kitchen door. Old habits. In his world, the men who forgot to watch the exits ended up in shallow graves along the Palermo coastline. He wasn't alone. He was never alone. 6 of his soldiers occupied the surrounding tables, their expensive suits doing little to disguise the violence coiled in their frames. They laughed too loud at his jokes, nodded too eagerly at his observations, and kept their hands near their waistbands where the guns lived. This was how Alessandro conducted business every Thursday afternoon, holding court like some Renaissance prince, while the city trembled at his name. Sara Inzaghi moved between the tables like a ghost, her movements small and apologetic. She'd been working at Bella Vista for 3 months now, and she'd perfected the art of invisibility. Head down, voice soft, eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze directly. The black apron hung loose on her small frame, and her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that made her look even younger than her 28 years. Alessandro watched her over the rim of his espresso cup, the way a cat watches a bird with a broken wing. There was something about her trembling hands that entertained him. The way she flinched whenever one of his men laughed too suddenly. Prey instinct. He'd seen it 1,000 times, that innate recognition that a predator was in the room. "Girl," he called out, not bothering with her name. He never bothered with names. "You've been working here how long now? 3 months? 4? Sarah's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the wine bottle she was carrying. 3 months, signore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 months, Alessandro repeated, leaning back in his chair. The movement made his shoulder holster visible beneath his tailored jacket. "And you still haven't learned to pour a proper glass of wine. I watched you serve the couple at table 7. You filled it too high." "Amateur." His men chuckled on cue, the sound sharp and predatory in the quiet restaurant. Sarah's fingers found the escape routes without her eyes moving. Kitchen door, 12 feet, possibly blocked by the prep cook. Front entrance, 20 feet, but Marco and Stefano were positioned there. Service hallway to the bathrooms, 8 feet, led to an emergency exit, but the door would make noise. Her breathing stayed shallow and measured even as her pulse calculated the angles, the timing, the acceptable losses if this went sideways. "I'm sorry, signore," she said, letting her voice crack just slightly. "I'll do better." Alessandro smiled, and it was the smile of a man who enjoyed watching things break. He set down his cup with deliberate care and stood, rolling his shoulders beneath the expensive fabric of his suit. The restaurant had a handful of other patrons, a young couple near the window, an elderly businessman reading a newspaper, a tourist taking photographs of his pasta. "Everyone out," Alessandro said quietly. His soldiers stood immediately, moving with practiced efficiency. Within 90 seconds, the restaurant was empty, except for Alessandro, his men, and the small waitress who'd frozen near the bar. The front door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid home with a sound like a rifle bolt. Alessandro shrugged out of his jacket and draped it over a chair. Then his shoulder holster. Then he began rolling up his sleeves, exposing the intricate tattoos that crawled up his forearms. Serpents and saints, crosses and skulls. The visual history of violence, written in ink on skin. The overhead lights caught on his knuckles, scarred from a lifetime of making examples out of people who forgot their place. "Boys," he said, not taking his eyes off Sarah. "Wait outside. I need to have a private conversation about respect with our clumsy little waitress here." His guards exchanged glances, brief, knowing, tinged with something like pity for the girl. They'd seen this before. They filed out through the kitchen, their footsteps fading into silence. Alessandro cracked his knuckles one by one, the sound sharp in the empty restaurant. Sarah stood perfectly still near the bar, her back straight against the mahogany, her hands hidden in the folds of her apron. The afternoon light painted half her face in shadow. The predator smiled. The executioner calculated the distance to his throat. Alessandro moved forward with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight that mattered. His fists came up in a boxer's guard, shoulders rolling, weight balanced on the balls of his feet. He'd learned to fight in the streets of Palermo before he learned to read, and every scar on his knuckles told the story of a lesson delivered. "You know what your problem is, little mouse?" He circled slowly, backing her further against the bar. "You think if you make yourself small enough, invisible enough, the world will forget you exist. But I see you. I always see you." Sarah's fingers slipped into the deep pocket of her apron. Her face remained a mask of fear. Wide eyes, shallow breathing, the slight tremble in her jaw that Alessandro had come to enjoy. But her feet, hidden beneath the table's sightline, shifted into something else entirely. Weight dropping to her heels, hips angling 45 degrees, the stance of someone who'd been taught that survival meant becoming a weapon. "Please, signore," she whispered. "I don't want trouble." Too late for that. Alessandro lunged. The serving tray clattered to the floor, spinning across the polished wood like a dropped coin. But Sarah's right hand emerged from her apron, holding something that made Alessandro's hindbrain scream warnings his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. The karambit knife caught the afternoon light, its curved blade gleaming like a predator's claw. 4 inches of surgical steel shaped like a talon, with a finger ring at the base that Sarah's index finger hooked through with the casual familiarity of someone who'd held it 1,000 times before. The blade curved inward, designed for one purpose, to hook and rip and open flesh in ways that straight knives couldn't manage. Alessandro froze mid-step. It wasn't the knife itself that stopped him. He'd faced knives before, had the scars to prove it. It was the way she held it, blade reversed along her forearm, edge facing out, her stance dropping into something that looked like Filipino kali or Indonesian silat. The trembling had vanished from her hands. Her breathing had slowed to the measured rhythm of someone entering a combat state, and her eyes, Christ, her eyes had gone flat and cold as a shark's. "You're not a waitress," Alessandro said slowly, his fist still raised but his advance halted. "No," Sarah said, her voice stripped of its timid quaver. "I'm not." The transformation was complete. The hunched shoulders straightened, the apologetic tilt of her head leveled into something predatory. She shifted her weight forward, the karambit tracing small, hypnotic circles in the air between them. A fighter's habit. meant to confuse the eye and hide the true angle of attack. Alessandro had grown up in violence, had climbed to power over a mountain of bodies. He knew the difference between someone who'd taken a self-defense class at the local gym and someone who'd killed with their hands. The woman in front of him had the muscle memory of an operator. The calluses on her knuckles weren't from carrying serving trays. They were from years of striking posts and breaking bones. "Who the fuck are you, really?" His voice had lost its playful edge. Sarah's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Someone who was trying very hard not to be found. The moment stretched between them, like a wire pulled taut. Both of them calculating angles and distances, reading micro-movements in shoulders and hips that would telegraph the first strike. Alessandro's mind raced through scenarios. He outweighed her by 80 pounds, had reach advantage, had killed more men than he could remember. But that stance, that knife, the way she held it like an extension of her own arm. The front window exploded inward in a hurricane of glass and fire. The RPG round hit the entrance with the sound of God's fist slamming into the earth. The shockwave threw Alessandro sideways into a table that collapsed under his weight. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. Smoke billowed through the shattered facade, acrid and black, filling the restaurant with chemical fog. Through the ringing in his ears, Alessandro heard the distinctive crack of small arms fire. Professional, coordinated, multiple shooters. He rolled onto his hands and knees, coughing, bleeding from a dozen cuts where flying glass had found him. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw Sarah still standing, the karambit gleaming in her hand, her body coiled and ready. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was counting the shooters entering through the burning doorway. The first gunman came through the smoke like a demon emerging from hell, his Uzi raised and sweeping. Sarah moved before Alessandro's concussed brain could process the threat. She grabbed a dinner plate from the nearest table and sent it spinning through the air with a flick of her wrist. The porcelain caught the gunman across the bridge of his nose with a wet crack, and in the half-second he flinched, Sarah closed the distance. The karambit opened his throat in a single fluid motion. The curved blade hooked behind his trachea and pulled forward, and the man went down without firing a shot, drowning in his own blood. Alessandro tried to stand, his legs unsteady, his vision swimming with double images. His ears still screamed with tinnitus from the blast. Through the smoke, he could see shapes moving. 3, maybe 4 more shooters fanning out through the wreckage of his restaurant. Professional formation, suppressed weapons. These weren't street thugs or rival crew soldiers. This was a hit team. "Down!" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. Alessandro dropped on instinct, and a burst of suppressed gunfire chewed through the space where his head had been, splintering the mahogany bar behind him. Sarah was already moving, her small frame darting between overturned tables with the fluid grace of someone who'd trained in close-quarters combat until it became muscle memory. She snatched a wine bottle as she passed, and when the second shooter rounded a column, she shattered it across his face. The man stumbled back, blinded by glass and alcohol, and Sarah drove the karambit up under his ribs at the precise angle to punch through the diaphragm and into the heart. He died standing up, his finger still on the trigger, his weapon firing uselessly into the ceiling as he collapsed. Alessandro watched from his hands and knees, transfixed by the surreal horror of it. The trembling waitress who'd apologized for spilling wine had transformed into something from a nightmare, a wraith that moved through smoke and chaos like death itself, finding throats and arteries with the surgical precision of someone who'd studied human anatomy for the express purpose of ending it. A third gunman spotted her and opened fire. Sarah grabbed a toppled chair and used it as a shield, the bullets punching through wood and upholstery as she charged forward. She got inside his firing arc before he could adjust, and the karambit found the inside of his thigh, severing the femoral artery. He went down screaming, his life pumping out onto the tile floor in rhythmic spurts. "Move!" Sarah was suddenly beside Alessandro, her hand fisting in his shirt collar. She hauled him to his feet with strength that shouldn't have existed in her small frame. "Kitchen, now!" Alessandro's legs finally obeyed, and he stumbled after her through the smoke. Behind them, he could hear shouting in Corsican French, confirmation of what he'd already suspected. This wasn't a random attack. Someone had hired the Corsican syndicate to end the Martini family's grip on Sicily. They burst through the kitchen doors, and Alessandro's disorientation cost him precious seconds. 2 more shooters had come through the service entrance, flanking from the rear. They raised their weapons, and Alessandro knew with crystal clarity that he was about to die in his own kitchen, cut down like a dog. Sarah's hand blurred. Something metallic flashed through the air, a paring knife she'd snatched from a prep station. It buried itself in the first shooter's eye socket, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The second shooter swung toward her, but Sarah was already moving. She vaulted over a stainless steel prep table, her feet finding purchase on the slick surface for a fraction of a second before she launched herself at him. The karambit took him across the throat in a backhand slash, and she landed in a crouch as his body hit the floor. She didn't pause, didn't check to see if he was dead. She knew he was. Instead, she grabbed Alessandro's arm again and dragged him toward the back exit. "Who the fuck are you?" Alessandro gasped, his voice hoarse with smoke and shock. Sarah kicked open the rear door, her eyes scanning the alley beyond, with the professional paranoia of someone who expected ambushes around every corner. "Right now, I'm the only reason you're still breathing." They emerged into the harsh Sicilian sunlight, leaving behind 5 bodies and the burning wreckage of Alessandro's empire. The alley behind Ristorante Bella Vista opened onto a narrow street where a rusted Fiat 500 sat parked with its windows down. Some tourist's mistake that was about to become their salvation. Sarah shattered the driver's side window with her elbow, reached in to pop the lock, and had the ignition wires exposed before Alessandro finished processing what was happening. "Get in," she said, her hands working with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd hot-wired vehicles on multiple continents. Alessandro slid into the passenger seat, his tailored pants now torn and bloodied, his face still bleeding from a dozen glass cuts. The engine coughed to life, and Sarah slammed the Fiat into gear, the tires shrieking as they shot out of the alley and onto the Via Roma. Behind them, shouts erupted as the remaining hit team emerged from the restaurant. "Head to the marina," Alessandro said, his voice recovering some of its command. "I have a boat there. We can—" The pistol appeared in Sarah's left hand, so fast Alessandro didn't see where she'd drawn it from. She cracked him across the temple with the grip, not hard enough to knock him out, but enough to split the skin and make stars explode behind his eyes. "Shut up." She didn't take her eyes off the road, weaving through afternoon traffic with one hand on the wheel, the pistol now resting casually on her thigh. "You don't give orders anymore, Don Martini. You're a dead man who just doesn't know it yet. The marina is the first place they'll have covered. Your boat, your houses, your mistress's apartment, every property your family owns, all compromised." Alessandro pressed his hand to his bleeding temple, rage and shock warring in his chest. No one spoke to him like this. No one raised a hand to him and lived. But the bodies in the restaurant flashed through his mind. The surgical precision, the absolute lack of hesitation. This woman had killed 5 trained operators in under 3 minutes. Then where are we going? He forced the question through gritted teeth. Somewhere they won't think to look. Sarah yanked the wheel hard right, sending the Fiat skidding onto a smaller road that climbed into the hills overlooking Palermo. Somewhere off the grid, the city fell away behind them as the road narrowed, twisting through olive groves and past stone farmhouses that had stood for centuries. Sarah drove like someone intimately familiar with evasive driving, her eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, her speed varying randomly to make them harder to follow, taking turns without signaling to confuse any potential surveillance. Alessandro watched her hands on the wheel, steady and sure, despite having just killed half a dozen men. "You're not Italian," he said slowly, his mind working through the puzzle, even as his head throbbed. "Your accent is perfect, but you hold the knife like Southeast Asian style. And that shooting stance, Israeli Krav Maga, maybe American operator training. Very good," Sarah said flatly. "Now shut up and let me concentrate." They climbed higher into the hills, the Mediterranean spreading out below them in an endless expanse of blue. The road became a series of hairpin turns carved into the cliffside, with a sheer drop on one side and weathered limestone on the other. Sarah took the curves at speeds that made Alessandro's stomach clench, the little Fiat's engine screaming in protest. That's when they saw the roadblock. Two black SUVs blocked the road ahead, positioned to create a kill box. Men in tactical gear stood behind the vehicles, rifles raised. Sarah didn't slow down. Instead, she accelerated. "What are you doing?" Alessandro grabbed the door handle. Sarah's response was to jerk the wheel hard left. The Fiat's passenger side tires left the pavement entirely, riding on two wheels along the narrow shoulder. Alessandro looked down and saw nothing but air and rocks 200 feet below. Time seemed to slow as the Fiat balanced on the edge of physics, Sarah's hands making minute corrections to keep them from tumbling into oblivion. Gunfire erupted behind them, the distinctive crack of assault rifles. The Fiat's rear window exploded. Sarah yanked the wheel right, and the car slammed back onto all four tires, fishtailing wildly as it shot past the roadblock. One of the gunmen tried to track them with his rifle, but they were already around the next curve, the limestone cliff blocking the line of fire. "That was Marco's crew," Alessandro said, his voice hollow. "My brother's men." Sarah glanced at him, something almost like sympathy flickering across her face. "I know. The roadblock was positioned exactly where someone with detailed knowledge of your escape routes would put it." Alessandro stared out at the Sicilian countryside blurring past, processing the implications. His own blood. His brother had just tried to kill him. The waitress who wasn't a waitress had saved his life 3 times in the last 10 minutes. "Who are you really?" he asked again, quieter this time. Sarah's jaw tightened. "Someone who was supposed to be dead." The vineyard appeared after another hour of driving through increasingly remote roads, the kind of place that didn't exist on maps or in tourist guidebooks. Rows of wild grapevines stretched across terraced hillsides, untended and overgrown, and at the center sat a stone cottage that looked like it had been abandoned for a generation. Crumbling walls thick enough to stop bullets, a red tile roof missing patches like a mouth with broken teeth. No neighbors for miles in any direction. Sarah killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening. Birds sang in the olive trees. A breeze rustled through the vines. No sound of pursuit, no helicopters, no distant engines. She'd chosen well. "Inside," she said, already moving. The cottage's interior was sparse but functional. A single room with a wood stove, a cot, a table scarred with age. But Alessandro noticed the details that spoke of something else. The reinforced door frame, the shutters that were steel beneath their weathered wood exterior. The cache of supplies hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Water, medical supplies, ammunition, and 3 different passports in 3 different names. None of them Sarah Inzaghi. This wasn't an abandoned farmhouse. This was a safe house. A bolt hole prepared by someone who'd learned to always have an escape route. Sarah moved to a battery-powered radio on the shelf and switched it on, cycling through frequencies until she found a news station. Alessandro sank into a wooden chair, suddenly aware of how much his body hurt. The cuts, the bruises, the ringing that still hadn't left his ears. The news anchor's voice filled the small space with clinical precision, confirming reports of an explosion at Ristorante Bella Vista in central Palermo. Multiple casualties reported. Local authorities suggest the blast may be related to ongoing territorial disputes between organized crime families. Sources close to the Martini organization report that Don Alessandro Martini was among those killed in the attack. Alessandro's hand tightened on the chair's armrest, hard enough to make the wood creak. His younger brother Marco Martini has issued a statement expressing grief and vowing to bring those responsible to justice. Marco Martini is expected to assume leadership of the family's business interests. Sarah switched off the radio. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush bone. "Your brother didn't waste any time," she said quietly. "He's already positioned himself as the grieving heir. By tomorrow, he'll have consolidated control of your organization. The men who were loyal to you will either bend the knee or disappear." Alessandro stood slowly, and when he looked at Sarah, the confusion and shock had burned away, leaving only the cold rage that had made him one of the most feared men in Sicily. "You knew. When you pulled that knife, when you killed those men, you already knew this was a setup. You knew they were coming." "I suspected." Sarah's hand drifted toward the pistol, still tucked in her waistband. "The hit team arrived exactly 3 minutes after you dismissed your guards and locked the doors. That's not coincidence. Someone close to you told them when you'd be vulnerable and alone. And you just happened to be there, working as a waitress in my restaurant for 3 months. Alessandro's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "Carrying a karambit and killing like a professional. You're going to tell me right now who the fuck you really are, or I swear to God." "You'll what?" Sarah's eyes flashed. "You're alive because of me. Your empire is gone. Your brother betrayed you. Your guards are probably already dead. You have nothing to threaten me with except violence, and we both know how that ended the last time you tried." Alessandro took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them until he could see the small scar above her left eyebrow, the kind that came from a knife or broken glass. "Show me," he said, his voice rough. "You said you were supposed to be dead. Show me why." Something shifted in Sarah's expression, a calculation being made, a decision reached. She held his gaze for a long moment, then reached up and pulled the hair tie from her bun. Her dark hair fell around her shoulders as she turned, presenting her back to him. With deliberate movements, she pulled off the blood-stained waitress shirt. Alessandro's breath caught. Her back was a landscape of violence. Bullet scars, entry and exit wounds marked her shoulder blade and lower ribs. A long surgical scar ran down her spine, but it was the tattoo that made Alessandro's blood run cold. Between her shoulder blades, rendered in black ink so dark it seemed to absorb light, was the image of a hooded figure holding a scythe. Beneath it, in Latin, mors certa, hora incerta. Death is certain, the hour uncertain. "The Wraith," Alessandro whispered, recognition hitting him like a physical blow. "Jesus Christ, you're the Wraith." Sarah pulled her shirt back on and turned to face him. I was. That life is supposed to be over. The ghost assassin, the one who killed the Russian arms dealer in Moscow, the Saudi prince in Dubai, the cartel boss in Mexico City. Alessandro shook his head in disbelief. Intelligence agencies across 3 continents have been hunting you for 5 years. You're a legend, a ghost story operators tell in bars. And I was content to stay dead, Sarah said, until you cornered me in that restaurant and forced my hand. The adrenaline was wearing off, and with it came the full inventory of Alessandro's injuries. Blood still seeped from the gash on his temple where Sarah had pistol-whipped him. Glass cuts covered his arms and face. His ribs ached where he'd slammed into the table, possibly cracked. He'd gone into shock without realizing it, his hands beginning to tremble as his body finally processed the violence it had survived. Sarah watched him sway slightly on his feet and moved with clinical efficiency. "Sit down before you fall down." She retrieved the medical kit from beneath the floorboards, a serious field trauma kit, not the drugstore first aid box of an amateur. Sutures, hemostatic gauze, antibiotics, surgical thread, the tools of someone who'd patched bullet wounds in safe houses from Beirut to Bangkok. Alessandro lowered himself onto the cot, his pride warring with the simple reality that he needed help. Sarah pulled the single chair close and began cleaning the wounds on his face with antiseptic that stung like fire. Her hands were steady and sure, the same hands that had opened throats hours ago, now working with surprising gentleness. "The temple needs stitches," she said, examining the gash she'd given him. "This is going to hurt. I've had worse." But his voice lacked its usual command. Sarah threaded the curved needle with practiced movements. "Hold still, and don't be a hero. If you're going to pass out, tell me first so you don't crack your head open." The first puncture of the needle made Alessandro's jaw clench, but he didn't flinch. Sarah worked quickly, her stitches small and even, the work of someone who'd been trained in battlefield medicine. This close, Alessandro could smell her, not perfume or the restaurant's kitchen grease, but something clean like soap and the metallic tang of adrenaline sweat. He studied her face as she concentrated, noting details he'd missed before. The small scar through her eyebrow, the way her pupils dilated and contracted as she focused, the faint lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard years. "You could have let me die," Alessandro said quietly. "In the restaurant. You could have killed me yourself when I cornered you, or just walked away when the RPG hit. Why didn't you?" Sarah tied off the suture and reached for the antibiotic ointment. "I've killed a lot of people, Alessandro. Men who deserved it, and some who probably didn't. But I don't kill for entertainment anymore. I don't kill because someone was rude or arrogant or stupid." She met his eyes, even if they deserved a lesson in humility. Alessandro felt something crack in his chest, not quite shame, but close. "I was going to hurt you. Before the attack, I was going to make you bleed just to prove I could." "I know." Sarah's voice held no judgment, just flat acknowledgement of fact. "You're a bully who spent so long being the apex predator that you forgot other predators exist." The words should have enraged him. A week ago they would have. But sitting in this abandoned cottage with his empire in ashes and his own brother's betrayal fresh in his mind, Alessandro couldn't summon the fury. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Vulnerability. "My father taught me that mercy is weakness," he said, watching Sarah's hands work. "That the world respects only strength. I built everything on that principle. Look where it got me." Sarah finished with his face and moved to his arms, cleaning glass from the cuts. Strength without wisdom is just brutality. Your brother learned that from you. Now he's using it against you. Alessandro was quiet for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the vineyard outside. When he spoke again, his voice had shed its armor. I need your help. I know. I need to kill Marco. Not just kill him. I need to dismantle everything he's built in the last 6 hours. I need to take back what's mine and make an example that will echo through Sicily for a generation. He caught Sarah's wrist gently, stopping her work. But I can't do it alone. Not against someone who knows all my moves, who has my soldiers, who's turned my own organization against me. Sarah looked at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. Why should I? I was out. I was done. You dragged me back into this world. Because, Alessandro said, and for once there was no manipulation in his voice, no calculated charm. You're the Wraith. You don't walk away from unfinished business. And a man who would murder his own brother, who would hire Corsican killers to bomb a restaurant full of innocent people. That's unfinished business. Sarah pulled her wrist free and returned to cleaning his wounds. But Alessandro saw the shift in her expression. The calculation. The hunter recognizing a worthy hunt. If I do this, she said finally, we do it my way. No more giving orders. No more assuming you're the smartest person in the room. You want to survive? You learn from me. Alessandro nodded slowly. Teach me. Dawn broke over the vineyard with the kind of light that turned everything golden. But Sarah had Alessandro awake and moving before the sun cleared the hills. His body protested. The stitches pulled. His ribs screamed. Every muscle ached from the previous day's violence. She handed him a cup of bitter espresso, made on the wood stove, and told him to drink it fast. Lesson 1, Sarah said, circling him in the small clearing behind the cottage. Everything you know about fighting is wrong for what we need to do. Alessandro bristled. I've been in 100 fights. And you won them all with size and reputation and the threat of retribution. You brawled. You intimidated. Sarah moved with liquid grace, her feet barely seeming to touch the ground. But we're going into a fortified estate filled with armed men who are expecting trouble. Muscle won't save you. Speed will. Silence will. The ability to kill before they know you're there. That's what keeps you alive. She spent the morning breaking down his habits, the way a sculptor chips away stone. When Alessandro threw a punch, she demonstrated how it telegraphed intent from his shoulder. When he moved forward aggressively, she showed him how his footsteps broadcast his position. Every instinct he'd honed through decades of street fighting and dominance, she systematically dismantled. You move like a bull, she said, not unkindly. All power, no finesse. But a bull can be led to slaughter. You need to move like smoke. By midday, Alessandro's shirt was soaked with sweat, despite the autumn chill. Sarah had him practicing entries, how to move through doorways without silhouetting himself, how to clear corners without exposing his center mass, how to use shadows and angles to become invisible even in an open room. His size, she explained, was actually an advantage if he learned to use it properly. Mass meant momentum. Height meant reach, but only if he learned control. The Martini estate, Alessandro said during a water break, his chest heaving. Marco will be holding court there, consolidating power. He'll have doubled the guard, put his most loyal men in key positions. Sarah unrolled a piece of paper on the cottage's table, a hand-drawn map she'd had Alessandro sketch from memory. The estate sprawled across 3 acres on the outskirts of Palermo, a Renaissance villa converted into a fortress. High walls, security cameras, armed patrols, a hardened target. He'll expect you to come in hard. Sarah traced possible entry points with her finger. Frontal assault, guns blazing, trying to reclaim your throne through violence. So we don't do that. Then what? We make him invite us in. Sarah's smile was cold and calculating. Marco is throwing a coronation, a ceremony where the captains swear loyalty to the new Don. Traditional, public, binding. He has to do it to legitimize his claim. Alessandro understood immediately. We infiltrate during the ceremony, while everyone's gathered in the main hall. You'll walk in through the front door, Sarah said. The dead Don, risen like Lazarus. It'll freeze them. Give us maybe 10 seconds of pure shock before the shooting starts. And you? I'll already be inside, hidden. Watching your back. She marked positions on the map. You'll need weapons, something close range. We're not trying to win a firefight. We're trying to create chaos and eliminate Marco before his men can respond. They spent the afternoon planning, wargaming scenarios, identifying the men most likely to remain loyal to Alessandro versus those who would die for Marco. As the sun began to set, casting the cottage in amber light, Alessandro found himself watching Sarah more than the map. The way she thought 3 moves ahead, the clinical precision with which she calculated angles and timing and acceptable losses. You're staring, Sarah said without looking up. You're extraordinary. The words came out before Alessandro could stop them, stripped of the calculated charm he usually wielded. Just truth. Sarah finally looked at him. Something flickering in her dark eyes. The professional distance that had been there all day wavered. They were close in the small space, close enough that Alessandro could see her pulse beating in her throat, could feel the heat radiating from her skin. This is a bad idea, Sarah said quietly, but she didn't move away. I've built an empire on bad ideas. Alessandro reached up slowly, giving her every chance to pull back, and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her jaw. The kiss was inevitable, a collision of 2 people who'd spent the day circling each other's gravity. Sarah's hand fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Alessandro wrapped his arms around her, feeling the coiled strength in her small frame. The passion that ignited between them wasn't gentle. It was the desperate hunger of 2 people who'd looked death in the face and decided to claim something living. They fell onto the cot together, and in the fading light of the Sicilian evening, the Don and the Wraith sealed an alliance that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with recognizing something kindred in each other's scars. The Martini estate blazed with light against the night sky, every window glowing like a challenge to the darkness beyond. Cars lined the circular drive, Maseratis and Mercedes, the vehicles of captains and caporegimes who'd come to witness the coronation of Sicily's new king. Music drifted from the main hall, punctuated by laughter and the clink of champagne glasses. Inside those walls, Marco Martini was holding court, accepting oaths of loyalty from men who'd served Alessandro for decades. Sarah crouched in the shadows of the estate's north wall, dressed entirely in black, her face darkened with ash. The karambit hung from her belt alongside a suppressed pistol and 6 other tools of silent death. She'd left Alessandro a quarter-mile down the road with instructions to wait exactly 12 minutes before approaching. 12 minutes to clear a path through Marco's security without raising an alarm. The first guard never knew she was there. He was lighting a cigarette near the service entrance, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder, when Sarah's arm snaked around his throat from behind. The blood choke took 6 seconds, and she lowered his unconscious body into the shadows with practiced care. Not dead. She'd promised Alessandro they'd minimize casualties among men who might have been following orders without knowing the truth. The second and third guards patrolled together, which complicated things. Sarah waited until they reached the blind spot between two security cameras, then moved. A thrown stone clicked against the far wall, drawing their attention for the critical second she needed. The suppressed pistol coughed twice. Tranquilizer darts, not bullets. Both men crumpled silently, and Sarah dragged them into the garden's deeper shadows. She moved through the grounds like a ghost, exploiting every gap in Marco's security. He'd doubled the guards, yes, but quantity wasn't quality. These men had grown complacent under Alessandro's reign, had forgotten what it meant to face a real threat. Sarah had fought in Fallujah and Mogadishu, had survived black sites and cartel compounds. This was practice. By the time Alessandro's 12 minutes were up, Sarah had neutralized 8 guards and was perched in the rafters of the main hall, invisible among the shadows and decorative beams. Below her, the coronation was reaching its climax. Marco Martini stood at the head of the massive dining table, looking every inch the Don in an immaculate suit. He had Alessandro's height, but none of his presence, compensating with expensive tailoring and the automatic rifle resting on the table beside his champagne glass. 20 captains and soldiers filled the hall, their faces flushed with wine and the promise of expanded territories under the new regime. To family, Marco raised his glass, his voice carrying through the hall. And to those who would betray it, may they rot in hell where they belong. The men laughed and drank, and in that moment of collective distraction, the front doors opened. Alessandro Martini walked into his ancestral home with empty hands and a slight smile. The effect was instantaneous and total. Glasses shattered on marble floors. Someone screamed. A captain closest to the door drew his weapon with shaking hands, the barrel wavering as his brain tried to process the impossible. The dead Don, alive. The ghost, made flesh. "Hello, brother," Alessandro said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "I hope I'm not late to my own funeral." Marco's face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. Shock, fear, rage, calculation. His hand moved toward the rifle, and every gun in the room swung toward Alessandro. 20 weapons, 20 angles of fire, certain death. Dramatic as always, Marco recovered his composure with visible effort, though his voice shook slightly. "Walking in here unarmed. Suicidal, really? Did you think sentiment would stay my hand? That I'd welcome back the brother who should have burned in that restaurant?" Alessandro took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Unarmed? Who said I was unarmed?" From her perch in the rafters, Sarah could see what Alessandro was doing, drawing every eye, every weapon, every ounce of attention in the room toward himself, creating a singular focal point. It was the oldest magician's trick. Misdirection. Make them look at your right hand while your left hand does the real work. "You're surrounded," Marco gestured to the assembled soldiers, his confidence returning. "You have nothing. No guards, no weapons, no leverage. You're a dead man who just doesn't know when to lie down." Alessandro's smile widened, and it was the smile of a predator who'd already won. "I have something you'll never have, Marco. I have loyalty that can't be bought, and I have the wraith in my rafters, with a rifle pointed at your head." 20 pairs of eyes snapped upward. Sarah's laser sight painted a red dot directly between Marco's eyes. "Hello, boys," she said from the shadows. "Nobody fucking move." Marco's hand twitched toward the rifle, and that microscopic movement shattered the frozen tableau. Guns rose toward the rafters, where Sarah's voice had come from, and in that split second of divided attention, she dropped. Sarah fell 20 feet and landed in a crouch on the dining table, her boots sending wine glasses and plates crashing to the floor. Before the nearest soldier could swing his weapon toward her, she'd put 2 tranquilizer darts into his neck. The suppressed pistol whispered death as she moved, her body flowing from target to target with the fluid grace of someone who'd trained until violence became art. Alessandro didn't wait. He lunged forward and overturned the massive table in a shower of crystal and silverware, creating cover as bullets began to fly. 3 soldiers opened fire wildly, their rounds punching into Renaissance frescoes and priceless furniture. Sarah vaulted over the makeshift barricade, her karambit appearing in her hand as she closed with the nearest gunman. The curved blade opened his gun hand, and he dropped his weapon with a scream. "Alive!" Alessandro shouted over the chaos. "We need them alive." Sarah adjusted instantly, her training allowing her to shift from lethal to incapacitating without missing a beat. A knee to a solar plexus, an elbow to a temple, pressure points and joint locks executed with surgical precision. Bodies dropped around her, unconscious or writhing in pain, but not dead. Alessandro fought his way through the chaos toward Marco, using the techniques Sarah had drilled into him. He moved low and fast, using the overturned furniture as cover, no longer the bull charging forward, but the predator using terrain and timing. A captain loyal to Marco stepped into his path, swinging a chair like a club. Alessandro caught it, redirected the momentum, and drove his fist into the man's liver. The captain folded. Marco had grabbed his rifle and was backing toward the rear exit. His face twisted with rage and desperation. "Kill them! Kill them both!" But the men were hesitating now, their eyes darting between their new don and their old one. Alessandro had taught them loyalty through fear, yes, but also through respect. And watching him fight alongside a legend, watching him stand tall in the face of betrayal, some part of them remembered why they'd followed him in the first place. One of the captains lowered his weapon, then another. "Marco!" Alessandro's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Face me. No guns. No soldiers. Just you and me. The way our father would have wanted." Marco's finger tightened on the rifle trigger, but the remaining soldiers had formed a loose circle now, watching, waiting. This was ancient law, older than governments or courts, a challenge between brothers for the right to rule. Marco could shoot Alessandro down like a dog, but he'd never be respected. Never be feared the right way. "Fine," Marco snarled, letting the rifle clatter to the floor. "I should have killed you with my own hands to begin with." They came together in the center of the hall with the fury of a lifetime's resentment. Marco threw wild, powerful haymakers, still fighting like the younger brother trying to prove himself. But Alessandro had learned. He slipped the punches using minimal movement, the way Sarah had taught him, letting Marco's rage exhaust itself against empty air. Then Alessandro struck, a clean combination to the body that folded Marco forward, followed by a knee that sent him sprawling across the marble. Marco tried to rise, blood streaming from his nose, but Alessandro was already there. He grabbed his brother by the collar and hauled him up, his fist cocked back for the killing blow. "Do it," Marco spat blood. "You're still the monster you always were." Alessandro's fist trembled. The old Alessandro would have done it, would have beaten Marco to death in front of witnesses to send a message. But he looked across the room and saw Sarah, standing ready with her pistol trained on the crowd, and he remembered what she'd said about strength and wisdom. He drove his fist forward and stopped an inch from Marco's face. "No," Alessandro said quietly. "I'm not going to kill you. That would be mercy. You're going to live with what you've done, and you're going to watch me rebuild everything you tried to destroy." He released Marco, who crumpled to the floor, and Alessandro walked to the head of the table. The captains parted before him, their eyes downcast in submission or respect or fear. Alessandro no longer cared which. He sat in his father's chair, the throne he'd held for a decade, and the room exhaled collectively. Sarah moved through the crowd with predatory grace, a bottle of Barolo in one hand, her pistol held casually in the other. She poured wine into Alessandro's glass with movements that were both elegant and threatening. The woman who could serve or kill with equal proficiency. But she wasn't wearing an apron anymore. She stood at his right hand in tactical black, her weapons visible, her stance that of a warrior queen. "Gentlemen," Alessandro said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Let me introduce you to my advisor. Anyone who has a problem with this arrangement is welcome to leave." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, through the morgue. No one moved. Sarah raised her own glass in a mock toast, the pistol never wavering from its lazy aim at the assembled soldiers. "To new management," she said with a cold smile. The captains drank. They had no choice. The king had returned, and he'd brought a Valkyrie as his enforcer. Power without wisdom is just brutality waiting to devour itself. Alessandro learned that true strength isn't about dominating those weaker than you. It's about recognizing when someone stronger can make you better. And Sarah learned that sometimes the most dangerous mission isn't the one that requires the most killing, but the one that requires you to trust someone else with your life. In a world of wolves, the deadliest predators are the ones who learn to hunt together. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more thrilling tales of unlikely alliances, hidden assassins, and the dangerous dance between power and redemption. Like and comment below. Which moment was your favorite? The restaurant confrontation? The cliffside escape? Or the final showdown in the Martini estate? Let me know what stories you want to see next.